I was driving the same old desert road, a stretch between Boise and Salt Lake City that I've driven a million times. The road was empty, the sky was clear and the night was silent, with only the sound of the truck's engine piercing the air. I was already tired, the heavy tiredness of the accumulated kilometers, but I knew that I would soon reach a station and I could rest a little. The road seemed endless, and the loneliness was starting to get to me, but nothing unusual until then. It was then that I realized I was being followed. It was difficult to see clearly due to the darkness, but in the rearview mirror, I could see a truck behind me, at a considerable distance. I didn't think much at the time. The road was deserted, and it could only be someone following the same path. But as the minutes passed, I began to notice that the truck was getting closer and closer. The feeling of being followed bothered me, but I tried not to think about it. I looked in the rearview mirror one more time and, to my surprise, the truck looked identical to mine. Same details, same colors, even the plates were the same. I've been on isolated roads before, but this wasn't normal. The tension quickly increased. I accelerated a little, trying to distance the truck, but what happened left me in shock. The other truck did the same. He increased his speed, just like me, as if he were imitating me. I got nervous and decided to brake sharply to see if the truck behind me was going to overtake me. But he didn't do that. He just slowed down with me. I was starting to panic. How can a truck imitate my movements so perfectly? I decided to try one more maneuver. I made a sharp turn, the truck slowed down. And the other one made the same curve, exactly the same. It couldn't be a coincidence. I was getting desperate. With my every move, he responded. It felt like the truck that followed me was controlling everything I did, as if it were an extension of me. Panic began to set in. That place, which already seemed so empty and peaceful, now became a trap. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something even stranger. The truck driver, if I can call it that, was there. But it wasn't just any person. It was me. The figure driving the other truck was a version of myself, with the same face, the same gaze fixed on the road. I was being followed, by me. My heart raced. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How could this be possible? I was being followed by a version of myself. A feeling of dread took over me, and a kind of despair began to consume me. I would look at the truck in the rearview mirror and see that version of me replicating my every move, like a perfect shadow. The face in the mirror looked blank, emotionless, just an exact replica of me, but something deeply wrong. I sped up the truck, trying to get away, but the other truck picked up speed, even faster, as if it was determined not to let me escape. The road seemed to distort as I accelerated. It wasn't the same anymore. Everything seemed to narrow down, and I felt like no matter where I went, that version of me followed me like an unwanted shadow. I tried several maneuvers, I took turns, I even accelerated in a straight line, trying to lose him in a curve, but he was always there, replicating all my movements. I didn't know what else to do. It was as if he was in a nightmare that had no end. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, there he was, closer, watching me, without ever looking away. Fatigue was already beginning to consume me, and despair only increased. It seemed like the road never ended. With every mile, the truck behind me seemed more real, closer, and I felt like I was being swallowed by the road. My reflection in the rearview mirror was no longer just an image in the mirror, but a presence, something that had a life of its own and was consuming me. I was no longer driving to get to a destination, now I drove to try to escape myself. And that scared me even more. I knew that, at any moment, that version of me could overtake me and take my place. That's when I saw a faint light in the distance, a gas station. I decided to stop. Maybe there I could understand what was happening, or at least have a moment to try to regain my sanity. I stopped the truck abruptly, making the other truck stop too. I took a deep breath, still trying to process everything, and got out of the vehicle. I looked at the truck behind me, and instead of seeing the version of myself, the cab was empty. There was no one there. Just emptiness, and the deserted road around. But the feeling of being watched continued. I looked around, and when I looked back at the truck, it was no longer there. There was no sign of the truck, nor of me. The road was deserted again, as if nothing had happened. But in my mind, everything had changed. I knew something much stranger was happening, something I couldn't explain. I stood there for a few minutes, looking at the empty road and trying to piece together the crazy experience. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that, somehow, I was still being watched. Fear took hold of me like a weight on my chest, and what scared me most was that, even though the truck was gone, I didn't feel free. The road was strangely quiet, which only added to the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, hoping the truck would appear again, but the reflection was empty. Nothing. I decided to continue my journey. I didn't know what else to do, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The road ahead seemed impassable, as if the surrounding darkness was closing in on me. The only thing I wanted was to go home and forget all that. But with every kilometer, I felt the weight of those images in my mind. I looked in the mirrors constantly, hoping to see the truck behind me, but it never appeared. The feeling that I was being persecuted, however, never left me. When I arrived in a nearby town, I decided to stop at a gas station to take a break and try to calm my mind. I wanted to forget what had happened, but the images of that version of me, driving the truck, were still stuck in my head. I looked around, trying to appear normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow I wasn't free yet. I even tried to tell the gas station attendant about what happened, but the words wouldn't come out. How do I explain that I was followed by a version of myself? How can you justify something so absurd? I got back in the truck and started to think that it had all been a nightmare, that my mind, tired from the road, had played a trick on me. But before I started, I looked at the passenger seat. What I found froze me. The bank was busy. Not by someone physical, but by a reflection. The reflection of myself, sitting there, looking straight ahead. I don't remember closing my eyes, but somehow I knew that the road wasn't over for me. I was no longer alone. And the most terrifying thing was knowing that, no matter how much I tried to run away, that version of me would never leave me. I was driving along the usual road, the same one that ran through the Oregon countryside. It was a rainy night, and the rain was hitting the windshield hard, making visibility poor. The truck was starting to drag, fatigue setting in after so many hours on the road. I tried to stay alert, but the monotonous pace of the trip was getting to me, and I couldn't help but think about the warm bed waiting for me, up ahead. The road was empty, with no other car in sight, and the sound of the engine mixed with the sound of the rain. That's when I saw her. A child, standing right in the middle of the road. She was too small to be there, in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, with the rain falling like the world was sinking. I didn't know what was happening, but my body acted on instinct. I hit the brakes sharply, feeling the truck skidding on the slippery road, and I screamed reflexively, expecting an impact that, luckily, didn't happen. When I looked at the place where the child was, he was no longer there. I stopped the truck, my heart pounding, and I looked around, trying to understand what had happened. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints on the wet road. Nothing. The rain was falling heavily, and the sound of the drops hitting the truck's cans made me feel like I was in a nightmare. I looked down the road again, but it was empty. Just me and the sound of rain. I couldn't help but wonder if I had seen it wrong, or if perhaps my mind was playing tricks due to fatigue. But I was sure of what I had seen. The child, wearing simple clothes wet from the rain, with dark, drenched hair, was there. I could still see her image clearly in my mind, her wide eyes staring at me, as if daring me to stop. In the following days, the image of that child never left my head. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just an optical illusion. But the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me alone. When I arrived at the destination, a friend of mine, who lived in those parts, commented about something strange that happened in the area years ago. A child disappeared on that same stretch of road, with the same description. He told me that they never found the body, and that the story had been hushed up by the police, but it still haunted local residents. The description of the child was identical to the one I had seen that night. My stomach turned, and a cold sensation ran down my spine. I couldn't get it out of my head. How could a child disappear there, on that road, without a trace? Fear grew in me with every thought, and I began to question everything. I was beginning to believe that what I had seen was not just a delusion. The description of the child, the clothes, the way she looked at me, it all made sense now, but not in a way I wanted to understand. I went to the nearest gas station and asked the attendant if he knew any stories about the disappearance. He hesitated, looked around as if afraid to speak, and then, in a low voice, said that many drivers claimed to have seen the child at night, at different times, but that no one ever talked much about it. It seemed like a dark secret that everyone tried to forget, but no one could. At that moment, I started to think that maybe I had been more than just a spectator, that I was somehow part of that story. The idea that the child was still stuck on that stretch of road, or worse, that it had been something that was waiting for me, left me in a panic. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind working too much, that I was becoming paranoid. But then, I got back on the road. I didn't want to, but I felt like I needed to go back. I needed to understand what was happening there. Night was approaching and I knew I had to face whatever was chasing me. When I returned to the spot where the child had disappeared, the feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming. It was the same place, the same road, but there was something in the air, something that made me feel like time was frozen. The fear was palpable. I stopped the truck in the same spot and looked to the side, at the strip of road where I had seen the child. The rain was no longer falling, but the silence was absolute. It was then that, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something small and fast, moving along the side of the road. When I looked directly, I saw nothing else. But the footprints were there. There was no one, but the marks of a wet child, small and fragile, began to appear, coming out of nowhere and heading into the bush, where the road seemed to get lost. I couldn't stay there any longer. The footprints disappeared as the rain began to fall again, but the feeling that something was still watching me, following me, didn't disappear. I got into the truck, no longer caring about how tired I was, and I accelerated as fast as I could, trying to escape that feeling, that presence. The road seemed longer that night, and the rain didn't seem to stop, as if nature was trying to keep me there. I just wanted to go home, forget what I had seen, but I knew it would never leave my mind. I had seen that child, and maybe, somehow, she was still waiting for me. Not in the physical sense, but something much deeper, something I couldn't understand. The feeling that I was being followed never left me. Even with the speed of the truck, it felt like the road never ended, like I was stuck in some kind of loop. The rain continued, but the sound of the water hitting the windshield now seemed distant, muffled, as if the road had become a world apart. I looked around, trying to find something familiar, but the darkness of the night surrounded me oppressively. At every turn, I felt like the road was swallowing me, and the fear only increased. I looked in the mirrors constantly, hoping to see the reflection of a child, or some strange figure in the darkness, but nothing appeared. It was then that, on the last bend, I saw something that made my blood freeze. On the side of the road was the child. She was there again, standing still, with the same fixed gaze, staring at me without moving a muscle. My body panicked, and I slammed on the brakes, almost skidding on the wet road. The truck stopped with a loud creak, and I stood there, frozen, watching that child. I could feel my heart pounding, my breathing getting harder. But when I looked closer, I noticed something even stranger. There was no more rain. The sound of falling water had stopped, and the road was enveloped in absolute silence. I looked around, and, once again, I realized that the child was disappearing, not in a normal way, but as if swallowed by the road itself. The footprints that had appeared before were no longer there, and the road was clear, as if nothing had happened. I looked back, and the child was just gone. The feeling that I was being watched didn't leave me, but the figure, the reflection, everything seemed to disappear, becoming part of the darkness that surrounded me. I didn't know what to think anymore. It was clear that something supernatural had happened, but how to explain it? How do you tell someone that you saw a child on the road who disappeared and that their footprints disappeared in a way that defies all logic? With my mind clouded with confusion and fear, I decided to return home. I didn't want to be on that road anymore, but the feeling that that presence was still with me persisted. I knew I would never go through that part again, and that I would probably never understand what happened there. The child. I didn't know who or what she was, but I knew something was wrong with this place. Something that could not be explained. I only knew one thing: somewhere, on that road, she was still waiting. But waiting for what? Maybe the answer was lost, in those footprints, on those rainy nights, or in something that would never be revealed. I just know that the fear I felt that night has never left me, and whenever it rains, I close my eyes and feel its presence, watching me, waiting. It was an ordinary night, another long and lonely trip down the road. I've been a truck driver for over 12 years, so nothing really scares me more than the loneliness of the road. I was on an isolated part of Interstate 70, driving between Kansas City and Denver, and it was after 2 a.m. The rain was falling heavily, the windshield was fogged up, and the road seemed endless. I used to stay up all night, but tiredness was starting to catch up with me. The truck's radio was on, trying to keep me awake with some station, but it was difficult to find anything decent. It was then that I started tuning the stations, trying to find something to distract myself. When I turned the dial, a strange frequency appeared. It wasn't a normal season. The sound was weak and shaky, as if it were interfering with other waves, but something about it caught my attention. At first I thought it was a tuning error, but as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't just static or interference. There were whispers. And they were not normal whispers, but incomprehensible words, something from another world. I felt a chill run through my body, but I couldn't take my hand off the button to change the station. Curiosity was stronger. The whispers intensified, and soon the sounds became clearer, but somehow distorted. I still couldn't understand what they were saying, but it seemed like the voice was coming from inside my head. Then, the sounds began to blend together with a crack, as if something was breaking, followed by a muffled scream. My heart started to beat faster, and I felt pressure in my head. That's when I saw something on the horizon. A light. I knew I shouldn't be there, it was an empty place, but for some reason, that light seemed to call me. I looked at the radio again, and when I looked at the road, it disappeared. That radio interference continued, but now the whispers became louder, clearer. I started to hear what sounded like a name, and what sounded like a familiar, yet somehow distorted voice calling me. I knew I was becoming paranoid, but something inside me was telling me to keep listening. At the same time, my body was screaming at me to turn off the radio, but I couldn't. When I finally managed to look away from the road and turn off the radio, the silence was deafening, but somehow, that voice still echoed in my mind. And the image of that light was still there. I tried to ignore what I had heard, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me alone. The sound of the road and the rain hitting the windshield seemed muffled, like I was in a nightmare. I decided to keep driving, trying to drive away the images of light and whispers. But then, as I passed a specific point on the road, something happened. My vision began to fail, and everything in front of me became blurry. I had to squint to try and see better, but for a moment everything went completely white. It was as if the road had disappeared, and I was seeing what came next, as if time had distorted. Suddenly the vision returned, but it wasn't the road. I was seeing an accident, a violent collision, the sound of twisting metal, muffled screams, and everything was so clear and real. It was as if I were there, living the accident, feeling the pain of the people inside the car. But when I tried to scream, I couldn't. It was as if my body no longer responded, as if I was being pulled into that vision. I knew the accident had happened on that same stretch of road where I was, but I didn't know how I knew that. When I finally blinked, everything went back to normal. But the feeling that something else was happening, something beyond my understanding, only grew. The next day, the visions continued. I saw quick flashes of accidents, people trapped in cars, the sounds of screams mixed with the rain and twisted metal. It was as if the images haunted me, following me every mile. I knew I was going crazy, but the feeling of being pulled into these events was inescapable. I tried to ignore it, I continued driving, but with every minute the feeling of discomfort increased. I didn't know if it had to do with the radio, the frequency I had picked up, or if it was all just my mind, but the line between the real and the unreal was starting to blur. One night, I stopped at a gas station to rest, but the mental fatigue was too much. I needed some fresh air. When I got out of the truck, I tried to turn around, but soon I saw a man, standing in the middle of the road, staring at me. He didn't look normal, he was motionless and wore strange clothes, as if he were a figure from an accident, someone who was lost. Fear took hold of me, but I couldn't look away. When I took a step toward him, the man disappeared, but the feeling that he was waiting for me, that he was part of something I still couldn't understand, stayed with me. I knew that somehow this man was connected to what I had heard on the radio. As he walked back to the truck, the whispers started again. And now I knew, it wasn't my mind. Something was trying to communicate with me. I got into the truck, no longer knowing what to think or do. The radio was off, but the whispers seemed to intensify in my head, as if they were invading me. It was no longer just one voice, but a series of overlapping voices, and suddenly, it seemed like I could clearly hear what they were saying. They were talking about the accident. Not the accident I had seen, but others. All those that happened on that same stretch of road, and the names of the victims began to form in my mind. I was lost, between what was real and what wasn't. The fear was no longer just physical, but mental, consuming me from the inside. The road seemed to have no end, and the rain never stopped. I knew that the radio had some connection with all of that, with the visions, with the voices, with the feeling of being pulled towards something beyond. As I began to look around, I realized that my truck's headlights were shining at a point ahead, and there, in the middle of the road, I saw a figure, once again. It was no longer a man, but a distorted image, something that didn't look human. That presence watched me, without moving, waiting for me to come closer. Each time I got closer, the voices got louder, clearer, until it seemed like they were all in the truck with me. It was at that moment that I realized there was no going back. I wasn't just driving anymore. I was inside something, in a nightmare that had no end. I sped up, trying to get away from it, trying to escape that image that seemed to get closer and closer, but the road was closing. The asphalt, which previously seemed like a straight line, now seemed to distort, creating curves where none existed. I didn't know if I was in a hallucination or if the road was actually changing, but the scariest thing was the feeling that I was being driven, like I was no longer in control. The truck finally stopped. It wasn't a normal stop. It was as if the engine had suddenly failed, or as if something had pulled me to a stop. The radio was on again, and the whispers returned. But now, they were clear and distinct, and I could understand what they were saying. They were calling me, asking me to continue, to move forward. I looked out the window, and saw that I was standing in an unfamiliar part of the road, where everything was too quiet. There was no more rain, there was no more anything. Just a road that seemed to have no end. I knew that, somehow, that radio, those voices, had taken me there. And I didn't know if I could get out. I was making a long delivery as usual along the empty highway between Las Vegas and Los Angeles when I decided to follow the GPS for an alternate route. Sometimes the traffic on the main highways is unbearable, so I thought it would be best to avoid the busier roads and take a shortcut. The GPS indicated an alternative route, along a secondary road, and initially it seemed like a good idea. The weather was closed, with dark clouds covering the sky, and night was already beginning to fall. I was tired, but I knew I would soon reach my destination. However, just ahead, something strange appeared. The GPS directed me to an old bridge, a rusty iron structure that looked like it had been built decades ago. The bridge was poorly marked and seemed deserted, with little lighting that barely illuminated the road. The kind of place that makes you wonder if it's worth continuing. The sound of the truck echoed differently over the bridge, more metallic and muffled, as if the structure was groaning with every movement. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity took over. The GPS did not give any other route options. I took a deep breath and drove over the bridge, feeling the old metal creak under the wheels. On the other side, the road seemed to go on forever. There were no other exit options, and everything seemed so empty, so abandoned, as if it were a road forgotten by everyone. The strangest thing was that the surrounding landscape didn't seem to change. The trees, the mountains, and even the terrain itself looked the same, like an endless repeat. I went around a bend, then another, but all I saw was more trees, more road. What bothered me most was the total absence of any communication signal. There was no radio, no cell phone signal, not even road signs. It was as if I had entered a place outside of time, where nothing else existed but an empty road. I tried to stop the truck, take a break, but when I looked around, I noticed something even more disturbing. The horizon in front of me didn't seem to move. The road seemed to be a loop, a continuous line that never ended. I turned around, looked back, but the bridge I had crossed was no longer there. The road continued, but in a way I couldn't explain. No matter how many times I passed the same curve, the surrounding landscape never changed. I was trapped in some kind of illusion, and there was no sign of life, nor of anyone else on the road. The place seemed to have been swallowed by emptiness. Desperation began to settle inside me. I was getting nervous, and the road seemed to swallow me more and more. I tried to speed up, thinking maybe I was imagining everything, but the feeling that something was very wrong only grew. The strangest thing of all was that no matter how much I drove, the road never changed. The trees were always the same, the vegetation was the same, and the surrounding landscape seemed like an endless repetition. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything, but what I saw was just the same road stretching behind me, never ending. I decided to stop once again, and this time, I got out of the truck. The silence was absolute, and the feeling that I was in a place isolated from the rest of the world swallowed me up. I looked around and realized that, apart from the road, there was nothing. No cities, no houses, no signs of life. I wondered why it was still there. Why had I crossed that bridge and why had the GPS brought me to that place? I knew that if I didn't get out soon, I might be stuck on that road forever. But there was no way out, and the fear that I was trapped in some kind of parallel dimension gripped me. I tried to restart the GPS, but the device screen continued with the same destination marked, the endless road. I did the only thing I could do, I moved on. If there was no other choice, I had to continue. But the feeling of being watched grew with every kilometer. I looked in the rearview mirror, still seeing nothing but the deserted road, but the weight in my chest wouldn't go away. The road seemed to trap me, as if I were being led somewhere where time and space didn't make sense. Every time I looked ahead, it felt like I was returning to the same point, as if the road never ended. In my last attempt to escape, I made a sudden maneuver, swerving to the side of the road, waiting for an exit to appear. But what I saw left me in shock. The bridge was back. The same old, rusty bridge that I had crossed before. I stood there, still, trying to process what was happening. How could the bridge be there again, as if it had never been left behind? Fear took over me, and I looked ahead, trying to see something different, something that would indicate that I could get out of there. But all I saw was the road that continued, and the feeling that I was trapped in a place that no longer existed. I knew something wasn't right. The bridge, the endless road, it all seemed like part of a nightmare with no way out. I panicked. I tried to do another maneuver, get off the road, but I couldn't find a way out of that cycle. Every time I passed that bridge, it seemed to reposition itself in front of me, as if the road was repeating itself. There were no signs, no choices, just that desolate path and the sound of the truck's engine, which now seemed dull and distant, as if it were being consumed by darkness. That's when I heard it. It was not a clear voice, but a whisper. Something low, an almost imperceptible frequency, that seemed to come from inside the truck itself. I felt a shiver run down my spine and I looked around, but there was no one. The sound of whispering intensified, and I knew I was hearing something I shouldn't have. The words were incomprehensible, mixed with the sound of the road and the echo of the rain that was beginning to fall again. The fear of no longer being in control consumed me, but something inside me, something very ancient and primal, told me to keep going. At this point, I no longer knew if I was on a real road or somewhere outside of time. I tried to stop the truck again, but it wouldn't respond. With my every movement, the road seemed to open up more, but also close faster, as if I was being pulled into a place that no longer had a beginning or an end. I wasn't just driving anymore. I was being led, guided to some distant point, where time and space didn't make sense, and reality seemed distorted. Finally, the truck stopped on its own. I looked around, but there was no more road, no more bridge, no more vegetation. It was as if the world had disappeared. Everything was in absolute silence. And, deep down in my being, I knew that no matter how hard I tried, would never leave that place. I was lost, condemned to wander forever along the endless road, and the only thing left was the road, repeating itself, eternally, without any explanation. The last sound I heard was the same whisper, and then, silence took over everything. It was a cold, silent night, and I was on my way to Portland. The road was long and deserted, as always, and the sky was overcast, the rain falling in thin sheets. I've been a truck driver for over 10 years, so the loneliness of the road doesn't affect me as much anymore, but that night, something was strange. The truck's radio was on, trying to keep me awake as I drove, but the programming was a mess, full of static. I never knew if this was something from the radio, the road, or whether the fatigue was starting to take effect, but somehow I didn't feel alone. Something was different. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, sleep hitting me hard. But, when I went to adjust myself in the chair and take a sip of coffee, I heard it. Breaths. There was no one next to me, and the passenger seat was empty, but I could have sworn someone was there. The breaths were low, almost muffled, but they could be clearly heard. I looked at the passenger seat, and when I looked back at the road, the feeling that something or someone was there increased. There was no way to explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone in that cabin. I tried to ignore it and kept driving, but that's when the footsteps started. Slow, heavy footsteps that echoed in the cabin as if someone were moving from one side to the other. I froze, staring at the steering wheel. I tried to rationalize. The sound could have come from outside, perhaps from the road, but it didn't make sense. I could feel the weight, like someone was moving behind me, but there was no one there. The radio, in turn, started turning on and off by itself, the frequency changing randomly, without me touching the buttons. The sound of static filled the cabin, mixing with footsteps, and I began to feel a chill run down my spine. My vision blurred, and I quickly glanced at the rearview mirror, hoping to see something that would justify what was happening, but the reflection was blank. The cabin was lit by dashboard lights, and the sound of footsteps seemed closer and closer. I was starting to panic. I didn't know what was happening, but I could feel something there, next to me, something invisible but present. And, with every second that passed, the feeling that someone was watching me, or following me, intensified. I tried to apply the brake, reduce the speed, but the radio turned off by itself again, and I began to realize that there was no longer any control. Something was happening and I didn't know how or why. The fear was palpable now. Every breath I heard, every footstep that echoed in the cabin, seemed more real than everything around me. I looked at the passenger seat again, but it was still empty. The feeling that there was someone there, someone I couldn't see, made me tense and disconcerted. It was then that the object started to move. First, a bottle of water rolled on the floor by itself, slowly turning, until it stopped at the edge of the bench. I looked at her, and my stomach dropped. I knew it hadn't been the movement of the road, or anything I could explain. The bottle hadn't moved on its own. Then the strangest thing happened, the steering wheel moved. It wasn't a strong jolt, but I felt pressure on my fingers, as if someone was touching the steering wheel next to me. I froze for a moment, my eyes fixed on the steering wheel. Nothing. The movement stopped, but the feeling that something was still there, invisible, was overwhelming. I tried to speak, as if talking to myself would be some kind of relief, but the words came out shakily, and the radio, which had been turned off, turned itself on again. The voice coming out of the speaker was distorted, but I could make out one word, back. The fear has now turned into panic. I was starting to lose track of what was happening. The cabin felt tighter, the air thicker, and I felt a pressure, as if something was watching me closely, without me being able to see it. The radio became more intense, static mixed with whispers that got closer and closer. I didn't know what to do, and the road in front of me seemed endless, as if it was taking me to some unknown place. I tried to accelerate, but the truck didn't respond. The feeling that I was being guided by something invisible, something that controlled everything around me, made me feel like I was being drawn into an abyss. That's when I saw a light. The light of a gas station in the distance. I knew it wasn't normal to be there, but I needed to stop. I needed to understand what was happening. As I approached the station, the light blinked once and went out, and the cabin returned to complete darkness, with the radio turned off. I parked the truck, the footsteps and whispers suddenly stopped, and the air felt lighter. But when I got out of the truck, an icy sensation ran through me. The station was empty, and there was no one there, but the feeling that I was no longer in control of the situation hit me hard. I was lost, and something inside me knew this road would never take me anywhere. That feeling of being watched didn't leave me, even when I got out of the truck. The station was deserted, the lights were off, and the sound of rain was the only sound that filled the emptiness around. I looked around, but there was nothing but the road and the darkness. The fear still consumed me, and when I looked at the seat of the truck, I realized that, for a second, it seemed like someone was sitting there, watching me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the vision of that invisible presence, which moved and made me feel like I wasn't alone, spread like a fog inside me. I decided to go back to the truck, but as soon as I got in, the radio came on again. The same static, the same distorted voice, and the words coming out of the speakers hit me hard, "You can't leave." I shivered, and a shiver ran down my spine. I looked in the rearview mirror and for a moment I thought I was going to see something. But what I saw was the reflection of the passenger seat. It was empty, as if it hadn't been touched, but I could feel the presence of something there. It was no longer the truck or the road that scared me, but the fact that something was following me, watching me, without ever fully revealing itself. I started the engine and accelerated, trying to get away, but the road didn't seem to end. The surrounding landscape was an endless repetition, as if the night had dragged on in an endless cycle. The road, the trees, even the sound of rain mixed into a distorted reality. I knew that no matter how hard I tried to escape, there was no going back. The invisible presence was with me, like a shadow that never left. I was stuck on the road, somewhere where logic no longer existed, where time seemed stagnant, and where fear became a constant, unchanging. And as the road stretched out in front of me, endless and aimless, I heard one last thing over the radio, before it definitively hung up: "You're never leaving again." Silence filled the cabin, but I knew that, somehow, the voice was right. I was lost there, on the road, in the cabin, and in my mind. And the worst of all was knowing there was no way out. Not for me. No more.